U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has called for a NATO reboot, accusing the alliance of losing its way. Addressing a meeting of defense ministers in Brussels, Hegseth spoke of NATO 3.0, which he described as a hardline military alliance. He scolded NATO allies over their military spending and announced the U.S. will be reviewing its troop deployments in Europe. Hegseth then lashed out at NATO allies for not supporting his country's war with Iran.
The United States has defended Europe for generations. And the president said, all he said was that our jets would need to take off from bases in Europe or our ships from ports to strike targets in the Middle East. Iranian targets that threaten European interests even more directly than they threaten us. But too many of our allies said no, or tried to drown us in arcane legal debates, or criticized us publicly for doing what they aren't prepared or able to do themselves. It was shameful.
DW's Teri Schultz is covering this in Brussels. Teri, why is the U.S. announcing a review of its military forces in Europe now?
Well, Terry, it's not exactly clear whether this is part of the larger review that the United States under President Trump has said it was going to do anyway, recalculate what it could afford to keep in Europe, look at what made sense for it to keep in Europe when it has interests elsewhere, of course, in the Pacific. But what was clear today, and you heard it there with Pete Hegseth's remarks, is that the U.S. is still very angry over the reluctance of European allies, in some cases even the blocking by European allies of the United States access to bases, for example, talking about Spain, for instance. And Hegseth then had the opportunity to use that frustration to announce this new 6-month review, which, again, may be part of an overall process that the U.S. is already looking at. But he certainly pinpointed this anger over European response to the war in Iran as the reason for announcing it now. Now, NATO 3.0 is something this administration has been talking about, but he really went into a lot of detail about the disappointment in Europeans and why the U.S. then feels that it is going to have to sort of, bring its assets closer to U.S. interests and that they will not be available to Europeans.
NATO leaders, obviously, this can't be a great news for them. How are NATO leaders responding? Are they concerned that this will create gaps in European security?
Well, one feature of NATO is that they try to make it seem like nothing's really wrong. Of course, they don't want to give a signal to Moscow that things are falling apart inside, and they aren't falling apart. Again, every time that this administration announces something else, which is sort of, not flattering to NATO, everybody says, okay, we can deal with that. Let's look at how we can, fill those gaps or even just paper over the rhetoric. And that's what they're doing again today. Every time that there's a new surprise, it gets less surprising. And that's how a lot of diplomats describe this. But I will say that many of them had hoped that the really high tensions over the Strait of Hormuz were passed now that the U.S. and Iran had signed this deal. And they thought that perhaps they could just provide, ships to help with navigation, help with demining, and that everything would be fine going forward. Now they're not exactly sure what additional resources the U.S. is going to pull back. This comes on the heels of reductions that were announced a few weeks ago in the NATO force model. That's the planning for what would happen in case of a crisis. And the U.S. has said, well, we're not going to contribute some of our, fighter jets, some other assets. And what they are really worried about is not being able to replace with European assets things like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The U.S. has the most sophisticated systems by far, and also deep strikes. Those are missiles that can go over 100 kilometers. Europe really hasn't developed its own capabilities yet. Ukraine has, and that may be a bright spot for Europeans to work with Ukraine on this. But at the moment, those are really the areas where Europe is worried that when the U.S. Pulls back these capabilities, they will not have replacements in the immediate future.
So huge tensions between the U.S. and its European allies over the war in Iran. How, or rather, are European members of NATO now looking at doing more in the Strait of Hormuz now that a peace agreement is finally concluded?
They are. And in fact, many of them had announced already while the war was still going on that they would be willing to contribute these capabilities, these assets, once there was no longer a hot war. And now that there isn't, they are saying, OK, we've got some of us have ships pre-positioned there that can help with demining, that can help with navigation, because, of course, all the European countries are also affected by the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. Prices are up here just like they are in the United States. So everyone is interested in getting traffic flowing again through the strait. And today, even as ministers arrived here, some of them said, we've got ships, we're willing to send them quickly. We've got them waiting. Now that the deal is signed, that still needs to be worked out in discussion with the United States, waiting to see what Iran is willing to do. But they are willing, and they were already willing. It just wasn't enough for the United States, who would have wanted a more enthusiastic response and possibly some contributions to the actual attacks on Iran. And that didn't happen, and that's why we are where we are.
Teri, thanks so much. Our correspondent Teri Schultz there in Brussels.